Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Jason Weller with the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. Hopefully, you are here to join us for the webinar on understanding the 2017 statewide data report. For those of you that have joined us in years past, you're probably used to just hearing from me, but this year we decided to mix things up, and we're joined by our data guru, aka Shannon Cherubini, and Mr. HMIS himself, aka Jerry Leslie. And of course, as you see today, I'm playing the role of the voice. So I was debating whether or not we could get away with doing Beastie Boys names. You know, I would be like MCA and Jerry would be like Ad Rock and Shannon would be like Mike D.
And
But
Mike D?
yeah.
That's
So
interesting.
that would be the other option we could throw out. It is the day before Halloween. Seems like only appropriate that we have, aliases. So,
Actually, Jason, I think it would be better to do the village people. Who would be who?
there's not enough of us for the village people. That's the
That's
problem.
true.
We
We'd
would
have to
need,
ask for a volunteer for a fourth, yeah.
we would need a lot more people for the village people. Uh, so, as those of you participating at home or at your office, wherever you might be in your car, you can tell that we are pretty relaxed and laid back today. All three of us are participating from our respective home offices. So, yeah, might be a very relaxed, might be a very relaxed webinar. So I know that there's a lot of folks who signed up. We almost maxed out our registration for this webinar. So I suspect that we'll have more people joining us. We already have a good number of folks logged in. For those of you that are already on board, I will say we have one handout this time, and I so, oh no. There's been a suggestion from somebody, from one of our attendees, that we should use our aliases as our actual signatures for emails and business cards. So that's something for the three of us to think about moving forward. Anyway, I was going to say that we have only one handout, and that is the actual report. And from 20 from the actual report we're going to be walking folks through today. Uh, at the end of the webinar, we can put the question out there if folks are actually interested in seeing the presentation once you've heard it, if that would be valuable for you. But ironically, I think this is the one time where we'd really like folks to take a look at the report itself. Ergo, that's what the handout is. Somebody's already posted a comment slash asked a question. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the GoToWebinar platform, we have, if you have a technical issue, meaning that you're having problems with the audio or the visual, unfortunately, we have very little control over that. So the best thing to do is actually log in or log out and log back in, because there's a 99.9% of the time it is a connection issue, either with GoToWebinar or with your internet connection. If you have questions about the content, then you can use the toolbar on the right-hand side of the screen, and there should be a little questions. You should see questions with a little triangle next to it. If you click on that triangle, a drop-down menu will appear, and you can type your question in there. And you have two options. You can send it to everybody, or you can send it privately. Most of the time, as long as it's appropriate, feel free to just put it out there for everybody to see, and we'll go from there. And we will try to address questions as they come up. So, with that being the case, I know we still have a few more people joining us, but we're already 6 after, and we've got a fair amount of content to cover. So I think let's go ahead and get started. And we're actually going to start with some poll questions, which is something we've done in years past. So the first question that we're going to put out there is, have you had a chance to actually look at the report yet? And keep in mind, there's no right or wrong answer to this, and this is also anonymous. So for those of you that say no or sort of, there is no dishonor in those responses. We also have no way of knowing who you are. So wow, we've got a lot of folks responding already. I will keep things open for another 10 or 15 seconds and see if we can pick up some more responses, but already over 3/4 of you have responded. So just
So,
great.
so for Shanna, is there the response category yes, and I'm absolutely sick of it?
Amen.
Yeah, I might have to add that for next year. All right, we seem to have topped out at 78%. So let's go ahead and close it and share it so everybody can take a look at what we got. So only about 15%, just well, 14% have said, yep, they've had a chance to look at it. Just under 70, no, and just under 20, sort of. So, okay, for those, the vast majority of you are definitely in the right place because we will help you understand the content. And for those of you who have had a chance to look at it, the vast minority here, this will also be a good opportunity to hopefully help you kind of prioritize and come to a better understanding of what exactly is in the report itself. Few other questions here about the way that you've been engaging, or your COC or your organization has engaged with data in the past. So out of curiosity, have you has your organization or COC actually used data in engaging with any of these groups in the last 12 months? Wow, there's a lot of people voting. So I will keep this open for another 20 or 25 seconds or so, give folks a chance to respond. Okay, we seem to be oh, okay. Just as I was about to say, we seem to be maxing out. We got folks filling in the survey.
Jason, the suggestion was made you should sing while we wait. So Jason's for taking requests and dedications if you want to make any
Yeah,
suggestions for
you
elevator
know,
music while we're waiting.
thank you, Anna, for the comment. I see that. I do have my phone handy. Be careful what you wish for. We might just put some Beastie Boys on the next time we ask a question. Okay, so we've maxed out, I think, in results. So let's see. Wow. Okay, so folks have actually, those of you who are on the webinar today, you've been doing a pretty good job of using data and getting it outward facing. So 50% of you have used it with policymakers at either, the local, state, or federal level. Nearly 50% of you have used it when talking with the media. 2/3 of you have used it when engaging with funders, and nearly 2/3 of you engaging with the general public, and 1/4 of you have used data for other purposes. So that is very cool stuff, and that's also reassuring for those of us giving the presentation today that hopefully, having a better understanding of the annual report will empower you and equip you with the things you need to feel like you can use this information with all these different stakeholders moving forward. So let's see. I've got one more, actually, got one other, maybe two other questions for folks while we're here on the front end. And this is a question we asked last year. And it's just more of a curiosity in terms of trying to get a sense of what other data sources folks are relying on these days. And of course, this is imperfect because we don't have a chance for folks to fill in the other category, but it at least gives us a sense of what other data sources people are paying attention to. Because I know at our level, we always feel like there's way too much data being filtered our way from the federal level, from other state partners, what have you. Okay, folks are being much slower to respond to this question. I don't know if that's because you're giving it some thought or because you've actually started your lunch or what it might be. But okay, now people are starting to respond. All right, give you another 5 seconds. Okay. And wow, okay, so this is a pretty even spread here. Quarter of you are using the Alice report, only 8% using the kids count report that the League for Public Policy puts out. A third of you are using census data, not surprisingly. Very few people are using the Prosperity Now scorecard, and about a third of you are using other data sources. Okay, so cool. Gives us a little bit of perspective and sense on kind of where all of you are at. And let me see, I think we've got one other question. Well, you know what? I'm actually going to hold off on that for later. So, a little bit of background about the report itself. Let me first off say thank you again for participating in those surveys or the poll questions. It gives us good background information. So in terms of background about the annual report here in Michigan, we've been doing it now for going on 10 years. I don't know if Jerry or Shanna, you happen to know exactly the first year it was done, but I want to say it was roughly 2008, 2009. It seems to be my recollection of when.
I think 07, 08 was the first year, but yeah, 10 years, 10, 11 years, yeah.
Yeah, so we're going on, yeah, we're easily going on 10 years here now, where statewide we've been releasing a report on homelessness. And really the context has been to provide, the macro level picture of what homelessness looks like here in Michigan. And with these webinars, we've realized that, over the years, we put the report out, and then I think there's this expectation that folks are going to engage with the data. But what we've been finding is that folks have been reluctant to do that for whatever reason. Perhaps because it's too much, or perhaps because they're afraid they're going to make mistakes and look at the wrong thing. So out of that came these webinars, which is really the sole purpose of them is to help all of you have a better understanding of what's in the annual report on ending homelessness, and get a better understanding of what homelessness looks like here in Michigan, at least at the state level. So with that being said, I'm going to hand things over to Mr. HMIS himself, aka MCA, and we can talk about the how and why of the or the why and the how of the annual report. Jerry, it's all you.
I'd be happy to do that. But one thing I'm going to put out as a big advertisement right from the very beginning of this is, as we're talking about the state numbers, one thing that is critical to remember, and Shanna will appreciate me for preaching this, and this is really, really an important point, is every year, as part of the annual report process, we actually take and release local numbers to each of the local planning bodies, each of the COCs, basically each local community breakout across the state of Michigan. And we have you all as local communities take a look at those numbers, at least they're supposed to, and review those numbers and again, validate those for us. But one of the key things that's super important is the information we release to you as the final runs of those reports. Those are numbers for you to take and use in addition to obviously the annual report from a statewide level to promote the work that you're doing in your local communities. So really, again, I want to just push this, that make sure that you're on top of reviewing those numbers every year, that you've got a regular process for doing so. And then obviously beyond that, that you've got a process in place by which you're going ahead and using those numbers for advocacy work and the work that you're doing at your local level, just as we use this information at a statewide level. So a couple of things. Why do you do an annual report? Well, first of all, it grounds the HMIS in reality. Because again, at the end of the day, many times information systems are big black holes where people pour information in, but it never comes out. What this does is this is actually a way in which we take information out of the data system that we all do this collection on and use it in ways that actually can benefit the work that we're all doing. Secondly, is it supports the management of resources. So, of course, as you all know, that we really want to target the allocation of resources across the state of Michigan and across our local communities in ways that will really positively impact the prevention and end of homelessness across the state. So what we see in this report are numbers that help us to, quote unquote, right size the way we're allocating resources to address homelessness. And this report is a critical tool to do that. It also supports performance improvement. At the end of the day, it's important to see how many people are homeless in different places, but ultimately, again, we're here to address the issue of preventing and ending homelessness. So what this report will do is it allows us to both, number one, look at the scope and the depth of homelessness across the state of Michigan, but then it also takes and allows us to look at how we're effectively creating positive outcomes to prevent and end homelessness. And again, so it allows some of that work to be measured, to be evaluated, and for us to continue to promote best practices, which are leading to improvements in outcomes. And then, of course, as we said before, and this is the big disclaimer put at the beginning about using your data locally, the report is only as important as to the degree to which it is used. So if we take this information and put it on the shelf and don't talk about it, and we run a report next year and do the same thing, this report is not going to have any value to it. This report has to be something that we use to educate people and to inform stakeholders, inform the general public, inform funders on the work that is happening to prevent and end homelessness, and then really use this information to move us forward within that process. So next slide. So where do these numbers come from? This is going to be our discussion of how we develop the annual report. Many of you know that HUD on a national level uses something known as the PIT count, or the point in time count, to do an evaluation of what homelessness looks like across the nation. This report is very different from the PIT count. And the reason it is different, the way that this is different, is the point in time count actually measures the number of people who are homeless on a single night of the year. So it takes basically an overnight period of 24-hour days, and it looks at how many people are homeless on that one night, on that one day. What the annual report that we do in Michigan does is it looks at all the people who have been literally homeless, or depending upon the report we're looking at here, of course, it's going to be based upon the Category 1 definition of literally homeless. For some other valuations, we can look at Category 1 and Category 2, but it looks at all the people meeting that definition across an entire calendar year. And in this case, we're looking at January 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2017. So if anybody was homeless across at any point during that year, they would be counted within this report. Obviously, if they're homeless with multiple episodes of homelessness, they're only going to be counted one time because this is an unduplicated report. But it takes into account the number of unique persons that were homeless during the course of the calendar year of 2017. Now, there's also another factor that comes into play on this. We call this coverage rate, or coverage ratios. So as you all know, and many of you will know, that we have a certain percentage of the total number of HMIS surveying agencies who actually, or the total number of homeless surveying agencies, correct my language on that, who are participants on the HMIS. What this also means then is there are going to be some homeless person surveying agencies which do not participate in the HMIS. So what we have to do from this, and you'll see this reference in a number of places in the report, is oftentimes some of the data that we'll be referencing is only going to refer to data that is pulled from HMIS participating agencies. For instance, our subpopulation breakdown, that is going to be applicable to that. However, what we try to do is, knowing that we have a number of non-HMIS participating agencies, we also use what we call a coverage ratio for calculating, based on the number of people we have in the HMIS, data on those people, what would be the total anticipated number of persons who experience homelessness in the state of Michigan. This would include both HMIs participating and those we don't collect in the HMIS, and create a full number of what that looks like. And we do that using a coverage ratio. Now, I'm not going to get into all the technicalities of that. There are a number of things, but suffice it to say, what we do take into account in there is we take into account people who may be at agencies that do not participate on the HMIS, but who also would cross over and connect at some point in the year with an HMIS participating agency. That's taken into account. And based upon that coverage ratio, we actually calculate what we anticipate to be the number of people who are homeless who do not actually connect with an HMIS participating. And so that gives us the total number that we take into account in this. And you'll see that as we reference it, the 56,231 individuals were in the HMIS, and the remaining 6,793 persons were estimating from non-participating providers. And actually, a majority of those people are going to typically come in from domestic violence providers, be survivors of domestic violence and families who are survivors of domestic violence. But there are other people who can touch other non-HMIS participating agencies that would figure into that number.
Okay, so I think we're going to shift gears. Thank you, MCA, for that. We're going to slide over to Mike D to get a breakdown of what the numbers look like statewide for 2017, and then also I think learn about some of what we know about subpopulations. Shannon?
So I got the coolest Beastie Boy because I got the best part of the report. Is that what's going on here?
You got it.
All right, well, let's take a look. So one thing that we are definitely happy to report is that we've continued to see a decrease, a slow decrease over the last couple of years. And we're looking at a 9% decrease in statewide homelessness from 2015 to 2017. And so when you look at the report, one of the pages in here is this homeless population map. And what this is it's going to show you the number of homeless in each of the regions, and then what percent of homelessness or of homeless individuals are within that region. So for example, Region 1 makes up about 5% of the state's total homeless population, where Region 10 has about 26% of the overall homeless population. So we have noticed, we've got, again, in the annual report on this page, we've got a list of each of the regions and what their projected homeless counts were for the 3-year period. And so you can see that some of the regions have shown slight increases in homelessness. Like, for example, Region 1 has slowly increased about 22% over that 3-year period. Some of the regions are showing relatively consistent numbers. So like Region 9 has stayed pretty consistent in their number of homeless. And then you've got other regions that have shown a greater decrease, for example, Region 2. So one thing that I do want to point out here is part of this is the fact that, there are swings in the number of homeless individuals in the community. People are being housed, depending on the resources that are available. We are reducing the homeless population, but there's other things that can come into play when we see these shifts in numbers. And so, for example, in Region 1, they may be seeing slightly more homeless individuals, but it's also very possible that there's just better data collection that has been occurring over that 3-year period. So more people are being counted. The counts are more accurate. We've got other areas that have shown a decrease, and again, it may be because they're housing folks, but we do also know that there's things in terms of agency process or practice that come into play that can also show that decrease in numbers. So, for example, with the coordinated entry system, when screenings are done on households, if a screening is only done on the head of household and the children's information are not collected at that point in time, if that family never comes through and actually receives a service, then that information is lost. So one of the things that we recommend is that each of these areas, each of these counties, take a look at your trends in homelessness and discuss what's actually occurring. Are you seeing more homeless people? Are you seeing less homeless individuals? Have there been changes in the process? Has there been staff turnover? What can be contributing to these shifts? And did we have a question, Jason?
We had somebody raise their hand, and unfortunately, we don't have a way to unmute folks individually. So the best thing to do is, if you actually have a question, please type it in the question box. I've got that open now. And if you're not familiar with how that works, it's the little triangle next to questions, should be right-hand side of your screen. And once you click on that triangle, it should prompt you basically with what to do. Hopefully that's self-explanatory for whomever it was that raised their hand. So
great.
Yeah, as soon as the question pops up, Shanna, I'll pass it along.
Okay. So that's just, I don't know, a brief glimpse of kind of what homelessness looks like, what the numbers have looked like in terms of trending in each of the 10 regions within Michigan. Next slide. So now we're going to take a look at the subpopulations. What does our homeless population look like? So we know that families make up nearly half of the overall homeless population in Michigan. The families are primarily comprised of young single mothers, roughly 33 years old for an average age, with 1.4 children, the average age of 7. And I'm not really sure what a 40% of a kid looks like. Maybe that's the part that doesn't give gray hairs to their parents. But so the family makeup. 62% of the adults in families are between the ages of 18 and 34, and 75% are female. And forgive me, somebody's trying to call in, so I might be cutting out for a minute. One thing that is kind of shocking, and this goes with all of the subpopulations, is the average monthly income at exit is $629. So, and this goes again across all of the different subpopulations. We have this listed, but when you're looking at families that are living in poverty and what it takes to have be able to successfully sustain your household. I can't remember, we had posted it last year. I'll have to look it up while the other guys are talking, but it was significantly more than that just to meet the bare minimum. So that's one area that is a cause of concern and that we do want to look at. 38% of the parents in families have long-term disabilities. The two primary disabilities reported were mental illness, so about 64%, and then 38% with a physical disability. About half of the adults and 61% of the kids in families are African American. And about 11% of the kids in families have a disability. Primarily, the most common disability reported among children was developmental disabilities.
Okay, so we actually had a comment/question from Michelle about where this information is coming from. And it is in the report itself. There's two places, and correct me if I'm wrong, Shanna, but there's a subpopulation page about families, and then there's also the table, the last 2 pages in the report itself, the big demographic table, is where folks can look at this information if they want to kind of follow along with what you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
We do have, there are also subpopulation individual pages in there on subpopulations, but we didn't want to just regurgitate the key points on those pages. So.
Okay. All right. So Michelle, hopefully that answers your question. As I said earlier, we can revisit at the end of the presentation. If you all think getting the PowerPoint would be helpful, I would be happy to share it. But obviously, we'd also like folks to be able to take a look at the actual report. Okay. Sorry.
Okay.
Carry on.
So moving on to single adults. And this is the first year that we've broken the single adult category out. So right now we're looking at single adults who are 25 and older. Those that are 18 to 24 fall under, in terms of federal definitions, they fall under the unaccompanied youth category. So of those adults that are 25 and older, the average age is roughly 45. the majority, 67%, are male. About a quarter of the adults are between the ages of 25 and 34. About half are between the ages of 35 and 54. And 27% are over the age of 55. And so that's a group, we consider them seniors for the purposes of this report, and that's a group that we're going to talk about in more detail later on. Now, for single adults, the average monthly income at exit was $708. 65% have a long-term disability. So there's a number of disabilities that are reported. The top three for single adults was a mental health diagnosis. Again, about 69% reported having a mental health diagnosis. 43% reported having a physical disability, and 35% reported having a substance abuse diagnosis. So that's also one area. When people picture, your stereotypical view of, a homeless individual, you picture an older male. I often hear a lot of misconceptions that, there's a large percentage of our homeless populations have substance abuse disorders. And when you're looking at the different disabilities, substance abuse is actually kind of lower down on that tree for our folks. So, and next slide. Okay, so we're getting into the youth, and what we've done with the youth is we've broken them out between the 18 and 24, so our older youth population, and then we have the under 18. So for those youth that are 18 to 24, the average age is about 21 years old. It's a pretty even split in terms of gender. So like 50% were male, 50% were female. 42% are white, and 55% are African American. Now, youth obviously have, they're just kind of starting out. They've got the lowest monthly income at exit of $168 on average. 45% of the unaccompanied youth 18 to 24 have an identified long-term disability. And again, mental health diagnosis is about 80%, 79%. You've got the physical disability at 15%, and then reported substance abuse diagnosis at 21%. All right, so with the younger kids, we're kind of looking at things a little different. We're not taking into account income for these kids. But one thing that we are looking at is foster care history. So there were, in the 2017 count, there were 698 unaccompanied youth who were captured in HMIS. 55% were female, 43% were male, and 2% were reported as transgender and non-binary. This is the only subpopulation where there was people were more apt to report other transgender and non-binary sexual orientation or gender. The rest of them were in there, but it was less than 1%. So the average age of unaccompanied youth is about 15 years old. 30% of these kids have an identified disability. And again, mental health diagnosis is the most common at 82%. 18% of them have a developmental disability, and 16% have a substance abuse issue. 1 in 3 of the unaccompanied youth captured in HMIS had an experience with the foster care system. And interestingly, 1 in 4 came from families who had a history of housing instability. So families who were either homeless or at immediate risk of becoming homeless. So that's also something definitely worthy of noting. And then we're moving on to veterans. So our veterans are primarily male, 90% male, generally a little older, average age of 51. 73% of them had a long-term disability. In terms of the split or the types of disabilities reported, this was kind of it was a little more even. So mental health diagnosis was about 60% or 59%. 57% reported a physical disability, and 40% reported having a substance abuse diagnosis. Veterans also had a higher average monthly income. And again, certain benefits and whatnot take effect depending on eligibility. So we imagine that that's a big part of what's going on here. But the average veteran income at exit was about $1,300. And then we've got our chronics. So I'm not sure who we have in terms of the breakup of the call. But for those of you that aren't in HMIS every day or dealing with the different homeless definitions, to be considered chronically homeless, an individual has to have a disabling condition, and they need to have been literally homeless continuously for at least a year or longer, or have been literally homeless on at least 4 separate occasions in the last 3 years, where the cumulative total amount of time for those 4 occasions was at least 12 months. So these are folks that are most in need. Our chronically homeless individuals have an average age of about 45, and they're about 65% male. More than half, 57%, are African American. And as I mentioned in the definition, they have to have a disabling condition to be considered chronic. So they all have a disabling condition. However, the majority of them reported having a mental illness. Again, 78% had a mental illness. 43%, the reported disability was physical disability, and 38% have a substance abuse diagnosis. So this is another area where that misconception of if they're chronically homeless, they must be addicted to whatever. Only 38% reported having that substance abuse diagnosis. The other thing I want to bring up about disabilities, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, is if you're wondering why the numbers don't jive to 100%, it's because people often have, they may have more than one disability, a dual diagnosis or co-occurring disorder. And then the average income at exit for our chronic folks was about $1,052 a month. Next slide. Okay. And I mentioned earlier that we were going to talk a little bit more about seniors. So for the purposes of this report, we consider seniors anybody age 55 or older. And seniors are our fastest growing homeless population. While we're seeing decreases in homelessness amongst the other populations, we are seeing a 4% increase. So it's pretty consistent every year. It goes up a little bit more. There was a 4% increase in homeless seniors between 2015 and 2017. 18% of the seniors are over the age of 65, and 3/4 of them, 75%, have a documented disability. And again, this is another pretty even split. About 58% have a mental health disability, 58% have a physical health disability. Seniors make up, or veterans, homeless veterans, let me reword that. Seniors make up about 49% of our homeless veteran population. So it's about half of our homeless vets are seniors. And they make up 27% of our chronically homeless population. And the average income at exit for seniors is about $990 a month. So again, across the board, income sustainability, that's an area that we're definitely going to want to focus on. And I will hand it over to Jerry to talk to you a little bit about outcomes.
So when we start talking about homeless numbers, obviously numbers themselves are important when we look at the depth and the breadth of what homelessness looks like. But the reality of it is, again, we need to take a look at what is effective, what is working, and how are we doing in getting people transitioned from the path of being imminently at risk of homelessness or literally homeless and getting them into a housing stability situation. So that is really what outcomes are about. And I know that there's ones that we don't have it on here, but there are 4 key measures that we've looked at in Michigan that are the key ones that really tell us, the kind of our dashboard, if you will, of what is happening in our efforts to address and end homelessness in the state of Michigan. The first one is going to be the total number of persons who are first-time homeless without a preceding episode in the previous 24 months. The second one would be the total length of time that a person is experiencing homelessness. They're on the streets or in shelters. Third would be the percentage of clients exiting to stable housing destinations or retaining permanent housing from a homeless situation. And the fourth is going to be the number of persons who have new homeless episode within a 2-year period after exiting to stable housing. Basically, we call this return to homelessness or recidivism. So there's a couple caveats that I do want to put on this, and I will put those on as we go through each of the numbers and review the outcomes, just so you're aware, because some of this would actually likely reflect performance that we're seeing in the state, but other elements of this will actually reflect the fact that as we've introduced these measures and really systematized definitions within each of the categories, that people are educating themselves, that agencies are really getting a good grasp on standard procedures, and then from that implementing it, which would tend to indicate that the improvement in outcome may be more of a construct of actual what we call quality improvement than it may be of actual activity and behavior of the person that we're working with here. So first of all, if you look at it, the change between 2016 and 2017 on Measure 1, the number of first-time homeless persons, we have seen a drop in persons in shelter and transitional housing only of 2%, and then people who are shelter, transitional, and permanent housing, a drop of 3%, which again is reflective of the overall trends we're seeing and is a trend in the positive direction. The second one, and this is going to be one of the first ones where I will say this is going to be partially an artifact of the process that we put in place. But you see the average length of time a person is homeless. In 2016, we saw the number as being 92 nights that a person was homeless. Within the year from 2016 to 2017, we saw the number drop to 50 nights. What, again, I have a feeling this is largely due to is a couple of things. Number one, a better measurement of the actual length of time that somebody's homeless. Number two, it will actually reflect the right sizing of the homeless service delivery system, that people and communities are putting resources where they need to be in the process of it. They're actually helping people get into housing quicker. And then number three, it would also reflect the changes in behavior in our population. So all three of those factors are going to be things that come into play on this, because if you look at the number, we see a pretty significant drop, a drop of about 50%. And there's a number of factors behind just client behavior leading to that drop of 42 nights from 92 to 50. The third measure is going to be the number of clients exiting to stable housing or retaining permanent housing. The first thing we look at is we'll see street outreach, that 52% of people who exit street outreach going up to 69%. So we see a 17% change in that number. Now, one thing that is really important to make mention on this, when we look at street outreach outcomes, people often look at it as that, well, there are often people who make contact with street outreach but then disappear. How does that all play into this? There's actually a definition we use, and the definition is something called people who are reaching the point of engagement. When somebody reaches the point of engagement, that is when we actually evaluate this outcome measure and apply it to persons that we're looking at in the subset. So if somebody connects with street outreach once or twice, they disappear, the street outreach program never sees them again, they don't figure into this. It really needs to come to the point where street outreach has a meaningful relationship with a client, that meaningful relationship leads to a full collection of information on that client and linking them with appropriate resources. And at that point, then the client becomes one who figures into this evaluation number. Also, the outcomes numbers from shelters and referee housing went up from 46 to 48%, inching in the right direction. Again, we're getting in the direction of about 50% there, which is on par with what we're seeing in other data sets. And really our permanent housing outcomes, so this is going to exclude rapid rehousing. This is going to be permanent supportive housing and other permanent housing. we are up to 96% either find permanent housing when leaving, or they retain their permanent housing at the end of the reporting period, which is a great outcome. And then looking at the last one is going to be measure 4. This would be the number of persons who are returning to homelessness after exiting to a positive, stable destination. What we're looking at here is street outreach. We are maintaining at 28%. Shelters, we dropped from 32% to 31%, a slight edging down there. Transitional housing, again, we remain the same. Permanent housing, we did have a 1% increase that people, 16% went up to 17%, that they actually increased the number of people who are returning, but the total returns did drop by 2%. We've gone down from 26% to 24%, and that is tracking slightly below what we've seen as typical numbers over the last couple of years. As we've gone through annual reports, we are actually beginning to trend down a tick below, which is a good sign of movement in a good direction.
So, what do we really need to know? We'll go over a couple of the key takeaway points here. In terms of the state, areas where we've been the most successful, as I mentioned earlier, the hard work that you guys are doing, that's happening at those agencies, at the community level, the collaborations, the coordinated entry, it is making a difference. We are seeing a consistent decline in the number of literally homeless. So over the past couple of years, from 2015 to 2017, again, there's been a 9% decline in literally homeless individuals. So those are the folks that are living on the streets and in shelters. Our literally homeless veterans have declined by about 7% in that same time period. Youth between the ages of 18 and 24 have declined by about 10%. And there has been a 20% decline in the individuals that are identified as chronically homeless. Now, this is one area where I do have a caveat. Again, work that's being done, we are housing our chronically homeless. We are targeting those that are most in need first. But there's also been a couple of definitional changes in what's considered chronically homeless at the national level. And there's been a couple of changes in those years in terms of how that information is collected in HMIS. And those changes to the definition and the data collection have an impact on what we're seeing in terms of who qualifies for chronic in the system. So that is contributing to this 20% decline as well. So hopefully it's going to stabilize a bit in terms of those changes, and we'll be able to get a better baseline. So we'll be able to get a more accurate report of what's happening going forward. The other thing that I want to point out is that 83% of Michigan's total homeless population had health insurance. So that's excellent. And Medicaid is the primary source of health insurance for our homeless folks. And then there's again in the annual report on those last 2 pages in the chart, it goes through and lists the other types of health insurance that our folks had as well, whether it's employment or VA. So we encourage you to take a look at that. Now, reporting the good is wonderful, but if we're going to be honest and transparent, we really need to look at those areas that we still consider challenges. And one of the areas that we really kind of focused on this year has to do with racial and health disparities. So our homeless population is disproportionately African American. 53% of our homeless population is African American, yet African Americans only makes up 14% of the state's total population. Same thing with the health. Nearly half, or 44% of Michigan's homeless population has a diagnosed disability, compared to only 14% of the state's general populace having a diagnosed disability. So you can definitely see these are areas that are hitting our homeless population a lot harder, or you can definitely see the disparities there. Families experiencing homelessness are getting larger. While the number of adults has remained relatively stable, the number of children and families has been increasing. It's increased about 7% over that 2015 to 2017 period. And as I mentioned earlier, we are continuously seeing a slow increase in the number of homeless seniors. So those are areas that we do continue to see as challenges, and that really do need to be brought to the table for further discussion.
The one thing I do want to say about the senior number too is the senior trend is one that we anticipate is going to continue to grow. And as you've heard us talk about this is very critical to know, because as many of you may be aware, the baby boomer generation, as they begin to age into the period of being seniors, you're looking at one of the largest demographic groups in the history of America. And of course, where we're dealing with a social safety net where those resources may not be available to them, we're seeing situations where, because of the sheer number of people in that population, there is going to be an increase in the homeless population as we look at that. And of course, it's going to be one of the key challenges for all of us to figure out in the coming years is how do we begin to provide resources and get resources on the table to begin to help some of our older members of society who may be facing challenges of homelessness.
So we also got a question in particular about the disparities, and this is from Angela, and she was asking if there's strategies or resources available to address these particular disparities that are outlined in the report. I can speak to the racial disparities. I know that the training outfit Spark, which is a project based out of the Center for Social Innovation, for those of you that participated in the anti-racism training that Micah hosted earlier this year in Lansing, that was through Spark. They are actually engaged with, I believe it's 7 or 8 communities across the country, trying to get a better understanding of racial disparities and kind of tracking back, looking at housing discrimination, redlining, and all the other practices that were in place for many years that have brought about these disparities. And they just released their kind of first round of outcomes earlier this year. And I feel like they still have several more years of in-depth analysis that they want to do, and as well as pulling in some additional communities. Jerry and Shanna, are you familiar with anything else either on the race or racial or health disparities that's going on nationally or here in Michigan that we would want to share with folks on the webinar?
I think there's all kinds of things beginning to pop up around the health issues. As some of you may be aware of, the SIM project that DHHS has done begins to look at the intersection around utilization of Medicaid as well as homeless situations in housing. Those models of programs, you're going to begin to see a lot more of them popping up as we go through and begin to draw some of these linkages. Unfortunately, I think the senior side of things is just on the cusp that there haven't been resources put in place on that yet. We've tried a couple things. We're still working on a few things. I know from Mike internally, we've been looking at some options. But I think that you're going to be looking at the next couple of years before some resources really get targeted to begin to address those issues.
Shanna, do you have anything else to add?
No, not beyond what you guys have already talked about. I do know that the disparity issue, the racial and health disparity issue, is really becoming a focus at the national level. So as Jerry mentioned, I expect there to be a lot more stuff that will be popping up going forward.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that warrants mentioning is that I think on both of these fronts, this is nothing new for Michigan. I mean, these numbers I think have been fairly consistent, at least year in the recent past. Is that correct, Shanna? Like, I don't think
Yes,
there's any movement at all with the racial disparities in at least the last 3 or 4 years.
that's correct.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Um, and I also will mention that a number of folks have now put in the request to have access to this PowerPoint. So, okay, you win. We'll make sure to send it out in the follow-up email I'll send out tomorrow. Make sure that everybody has access to this information. But again, we'd also like, yes, you're welcome, but also we would like folks to actually look at the report itself as well, so that you can see kind of the where all this is coming from. So before we get into Q&A, just want to highlight a couple of things. The last couple of years, folks have asked Micah to come up with some talking points based on the report. And so the team here and working with the writing team for the actual report itself, pulled together a couple of things, really just highlighting a lot of the things Shannon was just talking about. And of course, you don't have to stop just at these, but these were kind of compelling themes that we saw coming out of this year's report. So it gives you kind of a baseline to work with, and as you're engaging with policymakers or media. And of course, the other question we get is, and it looks like you are a fairly savvy crowd given the response to the poll question earlier, in regards to what to do with the data. But in terms of timing, the last couple of years we've done this webinar, we tried to coordinate it with roughly the start of November, because we know that's when a lot of y'all are organizing awareness raising events in your communities. And so we want to make sure that this information, this data, is front and center in your mind as you're going through and creating, takeaways or handouts for the general public, takeaways for the media or for elected officials. So want to make sure that you're definitely thinking about that. As Jerry said at the beginning, you should already have access to local level data that's comparable to what we've been talking about here at the macro state level. But if for whatever reason you're uncomfortable with engaging with that local data, you've at least got some regional and some state level data that you can throw out to folks. And of course, the fact that this report was just released, I think officially about 2 weeks ago, almost from today, it's still some fresh data. This year, we've not seen a lot of media coverage at the state level about the report, but last couple of years, we've noticed that once we hit November, December with the awareness events, all of a sudden it's you all who are taking the reins and kind of engaging with media and getting the word out about the information that's in the report. So we're very grateful for that. And so we want to make sure that we're enabling and empowering you with the information that you need. So let me take one quick look at this question from, Michelle, I'll address your question offline. And I think we've had a handful of other questions come in. But before we get to those, now that we've had a chance to walk through the report, I do have a couple more poll questions that I wanted to put out to everybody. And we'll go ahead and do that. And then I think we'll open the floor up to Q&A. So this was a question that I debated asking at the beginning, but I'll ask it now. So now that we've kind of walked you through the annual report at the state level, interested to hear if there's other ways that you'd like to use data. And so this is building off the question I asked at the front end with how are you currently using data? And now this gets to, are there other areas where you identified and said, yeah, we'd like to do this, we just haven't gotten there yet? And Kamisha, I see your question about going back. We'll actually send out the PowerPoint. It'll likely go out via email tomorrow. So you have no reason to take the screenshot. You'll be able to, unless of course you want to share it on social media. Now I'm kind of talking it through myself. So I will scroll back here in a second so you can do a screenshot. But just for your reference, we will send out the report tomorrow. So you'll have access to it. And all right, I think we've got pretty good response rate now. Okay, so yeah, just kind of answered my own question, I think, with Kamisha's request to scroll back for a second. So about a third of you say fundraising. Almost all of you would like to use data more in engaging with policymakers and advocacy efforts. 2/3 engaging with the media, and again, 2/3 with social media. So very cool stuff. So hold on a second. Let me do two things here. Scroll back. So I think this is actually the page that Kamisha was asking for with the talking points. And then one more, and this is the last poll question, I promise everybody. So one more poll question about what other materials the coalition can put together to help you be successful. As I said, the talking points that we've put out here today, that came out of a request from you all, from folks out in the field. Similarly, you'll notice that at the front end of the actual report, there's an executive summary this year, and which is also new, and a pretty comprehensive executive summary of the report. So again, that came out of requests from everybody in the field in terms of what would be useful for them. So what we're always interested in learning other ways that we can help support the work that you're doing, especially around data and using it. You know, all goes back to what Jerry said at the very beginning. If we build it and nobody uses it, it doesn't really, at the end of the day, it doesn't really help anybody out.
One thing that I did this year that was different is when I was preparing the data for the statewide report, I actually went through and created, there's that table at the back of the annual report that we pulled most of this information off of, the population subpopulation table. I created one of those for each of the regions. So like with regional data. So the Micah team can kind of get together and hash out the details, but I don't see there being any issue with making that available, you know, on the website or whatnot, so that you guys have your regional data to discuss as well. So we will follow up with you more on that.
Okay. Thanks, Shanna. So, okay. A lot of folks would like talking points, which we can share. Obviously, we're sending out the PowerPoint tomorrow. So, and the talking points are embedded in this. Additional graphics and visual aids, that's something we played around with last year, primarily for use on social media. So we can definitely do that as well. Along those lines, one thing that we did do on our Facebook page is create a quiz about the annual report. And I think we've only had one person. I have to go back and take a look at the responses, but we've had very few people get 100%, and it's only a 5-question quiz, and they're not tricky questions. It's, you know, a lot of the basic stuff that we covered today, obviously. But even folks who've been in the field for a long time did not get 100%. So, you know, if you're thinking about ways that you can engage the general public, especially if you know you have a lot of folks that are using social media, that would be a good example to kind of get outside the box in terms of, you know, getting the message out, especially if you're incorporating some local level data. Because if you're trying to overcome or combat the NIMBYism, that would be a good way to do it. And it also gives you a little bit of data at the back end as well. So of course, data templates and executive summaries are also high up there as well. So basically a little bit of everything. Whatever we can keep doing, it looks like folks are interested in using. So I know we've gone over on time. We've had a couple of more questions that have come in. And of course, a lot of folks have been asking about making sure we are going to share the data and or share the PowerPoint, which we will do. Um, oh, so some of the other questions, Michelle, with the Facebook quiz, I think if you just go to the MICA Facebook page, you should be able and find the quiz. You should be able to share it. I know we've had a number of folks do that already. Unfortunately, it's embedded in the Facebook page, so I don't know if we can send the link out, um, via email tomorrow, but I will take a look at that. Angela, I see your comment about including vouchers, or looking at other data sources that lives outside of HMIS, like vouchers, LIHTC, etc. Jerry and Shanna, have you had any engagement around any of these other kind of things that touch on homelessness, such as vouchers, LIHTC units, things
Yeah,
like that?
there's ultimately some huge challenges with that, and for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think one of the big things that is part of the benefits, part of the huge positive of the Michigan report is that it's designed to create unduplicated numbers, to look at numbers from an unduplication standpoint. One of the challenges we have with bringing data from multiple sources is it's really difficult to do that. But even more so, the second challenge we have with that is, again, sometimes getting the data from those sources and being able to parse it in such a way and which it makes sense, like from an apples to apples basis, is really difficult, which is why we have not always included that data in there, because there are overlaps, but there are also some very big non-overlapping areas that come into play. So we're always looking for ways to be better in those areas, incorporating other data sources, but it becomes really difficult to do so and keep the integrity of what we're trying to accomplish with the annual report within HMIS.
Okay. And then I think we've got one last big question, and this has to do with the income issue, which Shanna was mentioning as kind of a recurring theme throughout the report. And the question is from Julie: what kind of challenges do homeless people face in access to actually using income they have? Is the lack of mailing address to receive checks, Social Security, etc., a major obstacle, or is it banking challenges that are kind of is it banking challenges that are providing the obstacles to people being able to access income and get back on their feet? Um, Jerry or Shanna, do either of you have a sense of
Well,
where
Some of
those challenges might be? Yeah.
so is the question mainly, if they have income, why are they not using it for rent in their own place?
Well, I think
If
there's,
what are the challenges that are preventing them from doing that?
yeah, I think it's more what are, is the lack of a fixed address, is that a challenge in and of itself? And then also I think there's, is that also snowball then and become a larger issue of even just access to banks and things like that.
Well, absolutely. I think all of those things are going to come into play. The mailing address, the um, documentation issue for IDs and whatnot. So that is all going to come into play. But there's, above and beyond that, as we talked about, the amount of income that our homeless population receives is so small. It's not nearly enough to get them back on their feet, easily. I had referenced earlier in last year's report, we had pulled a data point from the Michigan League for Public Policy, and it stated that the average single parent needs to make $3,680 a month just to make ends meet. But the average income for our homeless families was, at that time, it was $770 a month. So you can see where there's that big gap. So there's a lot of things that come into play. And then of course there's the catch-22. Some of this is benefit income, Social Security and whatnot. There's definitely employment income, but as far as those that don't have employment income, getting a job or getting a better job. I mean, if you don't have a home, there's shower issues. I mean, there's a lot of barriers that come into play. And some of these folks may have income, but they may also be, single fathers out there who have child support that they need to be paying, or so that's a whole nother webinar, a whole nother discussion.
Well, two of the things, Jenny, you just brought up, the one thing that is a huge barrier for when we talk about earned income, if there are children involved in the household, is obviously going to be childcare and making sure
Absolutely.
that there's appropriate childcare for their children. The second thing that is a huge issue, and we did this back with HBRP, we did some research on this, but one of the major factors which affects somebody's ability to generate earned income is transportation to and from employment. And the people who are in homeless situations often have very difficult time obtaining transportation, even in urban areas, but particularly in rural areas, especially if there's issues with the cost of housing and they're forced to move to a more secluded, if you will, area, which is away from main lines of transportation. It provides some significant hurdles for them to be able to maintain jobs and maintain earned income.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. Thank you, Julie, for asking that question. It's as Shanna said, I think it's between that and some of the other major disparities and issues that we're seeing within the report almost warrants a second webinar or a series of webinars. And obviously goes way beyond what we're able to talk about today, especially since we're already about 15 minutes over time, and we've seen people starting to drop off. So I'm not seeing any. I haven't seen any new questions come in. A few folks have provided comments, thanking us for hosting the webinar today, and saying that this was useful content. And also, Stephanie, I did see that in regards to the question about, LIHTC and housing choice vouchers and kind of where that fits in with the scheme of things, that over 50% of, so Stephanie Oles at MSHDA has provided the comment that over 50% of MSHDA's 28,000 HCV portfolio has gone to people who have experienced homelessness. So I think that might be a data source that Angela was referring to earlier with her question about looking at vouchers and how they come into play. And I think MSHDA is actually has a good chunk of that type of information. So, okay, let me just scroll through one more time, make sure I haven't missed anything. So, Jerry, Shanna, thank you for joining us. I think given the comments and given the questions, this was a wildly successful webinar and also one of the largest ones we've had in quite some time. So in terms of the folks who came out, we nearly maxed out our registration. So always a good problem to have. And of course, have everybody on the webinar has my contact information. So if there's anything that comes up afterwards where you get off the webinar and later today going, oh shoot, I wanted to ask a question about this, don't be afraid to shoot me an email and I can forward it to Jerry and Shanna, and then once you get the response, send it out to the whole group. So thank you everybody for joining us, and good luck for all of you who are planning events in the next couple of weeks and getting out there and building awareness about homelessness. Hope you have very good events, and in the meantime, hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thanks everybody.
Take care, all.